last 5 or so years, Kenya's public debt has accumulated. And it's accumulated as measured both in nominal terms. So right now it's about 6.3, 6.4 trillion, as reported by government in September last year. Our assessment is probably closer to 7 trillion if you take all factors in. Now, the Public Finance Management Law, together with the Constitution, provides a threshold, and in that threshold it states that public debt should not at any time be more than 50% of GDP. That figure was already passed last year. And so one of the things that happened was the Treasury, therefore, brought a legal notice number 155 of 2019, was brought before Parliament. The reason for that was to make sure that Parliament would raise that threshold. So remember, originally debt was measured as 50%, or rather the threshold was 50% of GDP. What this new law brought in, the legal notice, now it's not a law per se, it's a regulation that is enabled by the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act and Section 260 of the Public Finance Management Act. Now what this law did was that Parliament was required to authorize for the budget ceiling to be extended. But basically what it was doing was not just changing it in terms of a ratio of the gross domestic product, but actually to make it a nominal or gross figure. So what they did was to say, we'd like Parliament to approve so that we can actually have the debt ceiling at 9 trillion Kenya shillings. It was presented to Parliament on the 26th of September, and then the National Assembly had passed it earlier, I think about a week before, and the last date was the Senate passed it on November 6th of last year. So the effect of this is that today, Kenya's debt thresholds are not measured as a share of GDP, at least from the legal standpoint, but it is measured as a nominal figure. So right now, because it's closer to 6.3, so if you say 7 trillion, it means we have a gap or a space of 2 trillion shillings to fill up. In the law that was presented, or rather, the one pager that was presented to amend the regulations, it was stated as if the technical change from a nominal, or rather, from a ratio to a nominal threshold has an advantage. As a student of economics, it actually makes no sense. So I'll try and debate here one of the things. So the purpose of the law when it was presented was effectively to amend Section 96B of the PFM, the Public Finance Act, and to alter the debt ceiling from 50% of GDP in net present value terms, and basically to replace that by simply making it a debt limit of 9 trillion. That's it. Now, how does that matter? At the time that this was passed in November, Kenya's GDP was about 8.7 trillion shillings, so it was close to 100% of GDP, right? So you can still measure it by GDP. So how we got hung up as Kenyans debating whether it matters one way or the other, and I remember sitting in some studio and people were saying, well, when you have it at 9 trillion, maybe so, maybe not, but really, it doesn't matter. Even if you bring it back to a shilling, it's a certain ratio of GDP anyway. What was the logic, and how was this logic presented to Parliament in both the Senate and the National Assembly? So I went through with my colleague Leo, who's here, we went through the line-by-line debates in the Hansard to find out what were the reasons that were stated. And then we'll try and assess those reasons for whether they make sense, economic sense, or not. I think you can guess my conclusion, but let's go through one before we conclude. So in the law itself that was presented, that one pager that the Cabinet Secretary presented, he does not state why, or rather the Treasury does not state why there's a preference for using a nominal figure as opposed to a ratio. And therefore the assumption is that it's self-evident. I don't know as professional accountants whether that is self-evident or not, but here are some of the reasons that they gave. One of them, the rationale that using the measure of a net present value, which means if you owe a debt, you ask yourself, this debt is owed over 20 years, but what is net present value? They were saying that it's an extremely complex way of measuring, and it introduces errors because both GDP is a moving target, or rather, it's not possible to measure GDP precisely. And then at the same time, if you're talking about net present value, that's not very easy to measure. Whether that's true or not is a different matter. I actually think it is not. Kenya's treasury has estimates that tells you what they expect the GDP to be the year 2022. So when they come back together to state that we were changing this because GDP is an abstract measure that's not easy to pin down, I wonder why Parliament agreed with them. But it seems some parliamentarians agreed. So their view is that because you have a measure that is amorphous, it's very difficult to monitor compliance. In other words, Treasury is saying, we want to be honest with you now. We want to ensure that you can monitor our compliance properly by making sure that we give you a metric that is simpler for Parliament to interpret. The truth, however, is, if that was what Parliament had, if that is what they sought, right, then they should simply have said that, fine, because we are seeking for you to raise the threshold so let's go to the reality. So what was 50% of GDP last year? 50% of GDP should have been about $4.5 trillion. 4.5 trillion Kenya shillings, sorry, right? Already our debt was at what? 6.3. So already they were in violation. And I think what this new rule was doing was actually to allow them to be in compliance, to protect that. And so there was kizungu mingi to try and justify when the truth is that there was already a violation, and so they needed to convince Parliament. So that's my view. The only thing that it did was, in addition to changing in a nominal sense, saying that we will not measure it by percentages, we'll measure it now by 9 trillion. I don't know what's clear about 9 trillion, because that was the other thing. Why not 15, right? Why not 10? 10 is such a nice round figure, right? Just like we had 50%, right? Why not we have 100? But somehow, there was a fixation with 9. And my view is about that fixation with 9 is that government had, in the next 2 or 3 years, the intent to borrow another 2 trillion or thereabouts. And for that reason, they were thinking that if we put it at 9 trillion, then it will allow us to execute as much debt as we could. One other thing that it did immediately, because they changed from nominal to the ratio to the nominal, to be honest, did nothing completely. Because if they had wanted to, then they should simply have stated at that level. But then what they did one thing immediately after, by raising it to 9 trillion, right? You provided room for more debt. That's one. And two, immediately they became compliant with what the legal effect was. So it was that's my interpretation of what the trick is. And it's true, because certain members of Parliament specifically mentioned that we are already in violation. It's important for us to make sure that the breach does not continue. So that's one of the things. But I think the other thing that this law did, this regulation change did, there was already at the beginning of January last year, and a member of Parliament, there are no secrets here, Honorable Kosgei, came to the Institute of Economic Affairs, and he had a private member's bill which had set about to actually set the debt ceiling to 5.5 trillion, and then he changed it to 6. His view was to bring a private member's bill to actually cap how much the Treasury could borrow, or how much we could borrow in general. The country could borrow in general. And I remember having a discussion with him, and I'm telling him, sir, you guys are okay, but you're actually trying to close the door after the horse has bolted. Because in our estimation at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the debt is already above 6 trillion. However, he was very, very determined, for good reasons. He brought it before Parliament, and our view is that by this response, Treasury was actually trying to preempt the passage of that law, because there was a negotiation and they agreed eventually. So obviously that's another thing that was achieved, because what he intended to do is to bring what he called a fiscal rule. It happens in many places where you have a fiscal rule about what the targets are for revenues, but you specifically put a numerated number above which there is no borrowing that could take place. I need to make a technical distinction here, which would be evident to students to professional accountants, but sometimes it's missed. Even our media missed it. Now, according to the Constitution, debt contracting is actually different from approval of debt. Debt contracting is basically who signs on behalf of the state, right? However, to assume debt requires an appropriations law, which means that the real people who procure debt in Kenya is actually Parliament. Parliament is the owner of the debt. They're the ones who approve that debt because they have to approve that debt, and every year they give a quota. So just because we have extended from 2 billion, from 6 trillion to 9 trillion does not mean that Treasury can go anyway and actually borrow the entire amount. What they're doing is just to give themselves space, and then every so often they would have to come with an appropriations law and justify to Parliament why they would like to assume that, to get that law. So there's a distinction between the debt ceiling and actually what the real authorization to procure debt is. So the procurement and the ceiling are completely different. The debates in Kenya conflate them. And you see most of the media speak very authoritatively about that. Sometimes they get it wrong by assuming that the debt ceiling means necessarily that means that we can borrow another 3 trillion. It would have to come through Parliament. So whatever happens, Parliament should have approved. So last year at the time when the first budget passed, so this is how it happened. The budget speech, or rather the budget estimates were presented. Parliament authorized the Treasury to procure debt of 638 billion, 634 billion. And by that approval alone, Parliament already provided authorization to Treasury to actually breach the deficit. So it's basically, the Treasury is coming back to tell them, look, we are saving you from your own mess by doing this. But I think it was also a trick by Treasury, because it was also in the Hansard by saying, if you've already given us the authorization to procure this debt, right, you cannot then come back after you've approved the budget and tell us that you cannot. So in a way, Parliament's hands were tied. And some members of Parliament specifically mentioned that we saw what you did to us. I hope they remember when the time comes. Now, if you look at most of the debates, again, looking about what, the reason I concentrate on Parliament's debates is because the Treasury on its own simply stated that we are trying to make it clearer. But really what they wanted, in my view, was a gap and space to borrow and to be in compliance, which is fine. But however, most of the arguments in the Hansard do not respond to why we are changing from a nominal, from a share to a nominal. The only thing is we need more debt, and by that, we need to give space and we need to be in compliance. A technical argument that was stated later, which is true, was that, look, we already got to the debt, our debt is expensive, and I wonder how raising the debt threshold when your debt is expensive really matters. But what was happening was basically, this is some kind of financial engineering, right? The government of Kenya had loaded itself with debts from all those commercial sources, and they were expensive. It was mentioned in the record. And part of what they were stating by the chair of the Committee on Subsidiary Legislation, Honorable Sholei, said that we need to provide ourselves with scope to borrow cheaper debt and replace it with the expensive debt that we did. We are not able to do that. She didn't say it like this, but I paraphrase her. We will not be able to do that if the debt ceiling remains as it is. In other words, we are in a debt crisis. We need to find a way to actually borrow cheaper debt with long tenure and then use that to pay off the debt that is expensive. So it's some kind of financial engineering. Smart. Why it had to come 6 years after, I do not know. But basically, my view about this bill is it provided an opportunity and a very soft landing for both Treasury, let me say the executive, and Parliament to get away from the fact that they actually did something that was extremely, extremely reckless. Allowed for debt to raise ahead, and then now they're trying to cover it up and coming up with diverting attention from us to actually debate whether the threshold should be a numerical one or whether it should be a ratio. Because even whatever number it is, it would be a ratio of GDP anyway. And so that's the point. Now, I think setting a gross threshold as a nominal threshold of 9 trillion is not a big change on its own, right? The only effect it did was it gave Treasury the opportunity to now execute its debt management strategy. And the debt management strategy effectively is we now have to go back to cheaper debt, wide tenure, which is sensible, and use that to replace the more expensive debt that we have borrowed. So that's the only thing it achieved. So through this law, a financial opportunity opened for that financial engineering and arbitrage to happen, which is okay, except the debate and the way the debt ceiling was sold was completely on different grounds. Now, as I conclude, I'll say this. Kenya is not the only country that has a debt ceiling. The United States has a debt ceiling as well. South Africa has a debt ceiling as well. And each country designs it in accordance with what is convenient for it. and in accordance with what Parliament thinks is the best way. Now, in the US Constitution, the Parliament, in the US Constitution, the Congress is the pass holder, just like we are the pass holder, but also the Constitution of the US says explicitly that the public debt cannot be repudiated, but Parliament is actually the owner of that debt. So actually the people should go to if you are owed money is actually Congress, not the executive. So that's an important distinction. For that reason, the US Congress takes a very, very significant role, and revising the debt ceiling right from President Obama's and future has been a very, very difficult time. In fact, that clause alone, and the law that supports that clause, has been amended 35 times with a lot of robust debate, even conflict between Congress and the executive and the treasury. It is because in some countries, the debt and procurement of debt on behalf of the people, remember, Parliament bears it, or rather Congress bears it, which effectively means that that debt is the people's debt. In Kenya, we treat the debt as a people's debt, but the money, when it comes, as if it belongs to treasury and people in the executive. So partly, it's a question about how we understand the politics of our constitution and how we set it up. Now, so as I said, a quantitative threshold or a ratio on its own should not matter. However, Congress takes the question of a threshold very seriously because they are the ones who own it. So that's the first point, which is the political context. The second point that is significant is that the United States borrows money only in dollars. So it can then set a nominal value, right? A gross value by saying, look, this is the threshold. Because it borrows in dollars. It doesn't borrow in... We, however, borrow in Kenya shillings, and at the same time, we borrow in another currency. What that means is even when you set a threshold such as 9 billion, right? Part of that 9 trillion reflects a currency, a foreign currency equivalent, isn't it? Which tells me that the argument by the Treasury that you need a number that tells you everything is still not right. Why? Because if today the Kenya shilling, for instance, depreciates, right? We could cross that threshold without new debt. So I think they chose an instrument that was convenient, but the justification and the rationale that they gave us required us to have examined it a little bit more. If they had said that for the component of our debt, right now of our debt, 40% is actually domestic, 60% is external. So when most of your debt is external, and yet you're setting a threshold based on your currency, it tells you that we are going to have to come and revise that debt ceiling very quickly and very soon. So in a way, we really didn't solve this problem. But that tells you that our debt management policy needs to account for the fact that we have two sources of debt. Or rather, we are debt accounting actually should be in two ways. Your forex account for accounting for debt, and the other one, which is the domestic one. And the domestic one of which we have more greater control, which we can set, and maybe that's a thing. So it's going to come back to us. Our preference at the Institute of Economic Affairs is for a share of GDP. It's not as unduly complex as government claims, because every quarter we actually give a debt, and every quarter we give a GDP growth rate, right? So we know. So you can monitor it by the quarter, to be honest, if we wanted to be completely honest and we wanted to be as accurate as is possible. There's nothing that says that a one threshold is. Because for instance, if we had serious inflation, and God forbid, if we had serious inflation, right, as has happened, the debt threshold could just disappear because your inflation has gone up by, say, 20%, right? It just eats up whatever threshold you have. So none of these things are, and the point for me is not that one method or the other is important. The most important thing is for Treasury and Parliament to admit that managing debt is essentially a complex financial thing that requires us to be more honest about what are the aggregates that we are measuring, as opposed to trying to lie that you have necessarily one number. The effect was that Parliament approved the spending and then later was convinced to ensure that no violation had occurred. So for a while, there's a violation. And I think as I conclude, I'll say, it is still possible to state the debt at any moment as a share of GDP it is. So today it is at 7 trillion in our view, about closer to 7 trillion, 6.9 or 7 trillion. Our GDP is about 8.6 trillion, so it's closer to 96% of GDP. Same, right? Same difference. Thank you very much.